The country is reeling from the police killings of 2 black men and the murder of 5 police officers in Dallas. Ryan Stevenson is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. The nonprofit group is dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. His team represents clients whose cases may be marked by racial bias or prosecutors' misconduct. It has helped more than 115 wrongly condemned death row prisoners. Stevenson has won awards for fighting poverty and challenging discrimination in the criminal justice system, and we are pleased to have him. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the presumption of guilt.
Yes, we have in this country a history of racial inequality that we really haven't adequately acknowledged. It began during the time of slavery, when the great evil for me was not involuntary servitude or forced labor. It really was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy that we created. And we burdened black people with these presumptions, with these prejudices. And we never really talked about that. The 13th Amendment doesn't deal with that. And it was fueled by this era of lynching. For decades, we tolerated victimization of black and brown people who were terrorized. And then we codified a racial hierarchy through segregation. And then we passed the Civil Rights Act, but we've never dealt with this presumption. And today, black and brown people in America are burdened with a presumption of dangerousness and guilt.
And you believe it has a direct link to slavery?
Well, I do.
And our inability to somehow come to grips.
I think our failure
with an understanding of the ramifications of slavery.
I think our failure to take seriously this problem is rooted in our unwillingness to acknowledge all the damage that was done by slavery and the damage that was done by lynching and the damage that was done by segregation. Look, I'm 56 years old. I've got a hard law degree from Harvard. I've got honorary doctorates. I've argued cases at the United States Supreme Court, and I have been pulled out of my car, and police officers have threatened to blow my brains out because of this presumption. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, how educated you are, you will go places in this country where you will be presumed dangerous. And that culture, this culture, has been created by this history that we don't acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, Brian, that it's so much bigger than what we're seeing? Because I hear people say, look, that was 400 years ago. Why do you keep bringing this up? It's much bigger than what we're seeing today.
It is much bigger, yes. These shootings, in my judgment, are symptoms of a larger disease. In this country, there are very few places where you can deal honestly with the history of slavery. There's no place you can deal honestly with the history of terrorism. We actually haven't dealt with all of that resistance to integration. And we are indifferent to this victimization of black and brown people. And that problem is a larger problem. And it's not just the people who are shot and killed by the police. It's the people who are beat by the police. It's the people who are menaced and targeted by the police. It's the people who are humiliated by the police. There are hundreds of thousands of black men and women and children in this country that have stories to tell about how dangerous it is when they are encountering police. And it's unfair to burden black and brown people in this country with the obligation to navigate police encounters safety. The burden is on you as a black and brown person to make sure you say and do the things that avoid some tragedy, and that's not right.
So when the president says we are not divided as some people think we are, is he wrong?
No, I think that there are opportunities to make a difference, but we have a real problem, and we've got to change. Listen, what happened to the police officers in Dallas is unquestionably horrific. Yes. And there will be no debate about the wrongfulness of that act. I grieve for those officers and their families. But there should also not be a debate about the wrongfulness of what happened in Baton Rouge and in Minnesota and in too many other places. And there will be a debate. Is that conversation happening, though? When you see tens of thousands of protests, people in protests, in all these different cities. Is there a movement afoot, though, to address that? Well, there is movement, there is reaction, but we've got to change the culture of policing.
How do you do that?
Well, you have to begin talking differently about what a police officer is. We have too many police officers in this country that think of themselves as warriors, not as guardians. You've got to change that culture. If 90% of the police training in many of the 18,000 police departments is all about shooting and fighting and not about implicit bias, you're going to see more of these encounters.
Do you think it's a matter of training? Do you think that that is the issue, a matter of training?
I think training is the beginning. I think our police officers ought to be the most sophisticated people in American society when it comes to not being directed by implicit bias, because they're armed, because they have responsibilities. They have to be the people we trust the most, not to presume others dangerous and guilty. But that's not what's happening. So we've got to do training. But we also have to change that culture. We've got to create some accountability.
How do you change somebody's bias, though?
Well,
Brian?
you actually get them to acknowledge that when they see someone of a particular race, that they're primed to think things that are unfair. And, you know, we've had to change our bias in the climate control area, right? We used to think it was appropriate to spray things and to use fossil fuels, but we learned some things and we've changed our behaviors. I think we're equally at risk by the smog created by our history of racial inequality, which we've all been breathing in, which has made us see black and brown people as dangerous and threatening and menacing when we're just trying to live our lives like everybody else. And there are ways that if we begin to acknowledge that, we have to create more shame about the police misconduct that we have tolerated. We've got to create more shame about segregation, more shame about lynching and terrorism, more shame about slavery. And when we feel that shame, we feel the act to do something reparational, something remedial. And that's not happening in police culture as much as it needs to.
But I also think it's important not to paint the police with one brush either. The way some people are saying the blacks are being painted by one brush, I think it's very important not to paint the police departments with one brush too.
I don't think there's any question about it. We have thousands of black police officers in this country. There are thousands of police officers who very much are committed to public safety. And that commitment has to be honored by changing the culture in a way that we can trust one another. We've done so little in this country to hold police officers accountable. Good police officers want to be held accountable. But when you have the court saying it's okay to lie and cheat, when we kind of tolerate this deception, when we don't respond as a community, black and white, brown and other, to these horrific shootings of young men of color, we're going to foster this continuing divide.
Brian
Thank you,
Stevenson.
Brian. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
Terrific.